The wind howled through the pines as Christopher Gray stood in his cabin doorway, his weathered hands gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Before him, Victoria Howard sat at his rough-hewn table, her considerable frame filling the chair with a dignity that made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. Her dark eyes held his gaze without flinching, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of mountains. "I am not leaving, Christopher. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. You can rage and storm and throw whatever tantrum suits your fancy, but I will not be driven away like those others. This is my home now, whether you like it or not." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from his dying fire, and Christopher felt something crack inside his chest. How had it come to this? How had this woman, this impossible, stubborn, magnificent woman, managed to do what no one else ever had? She had seen past his carefully constructed walls, past the deliberate cruelty he wielded like a weapon, and she had chosen to stay. But that moment, that declaration of war disguised as devotion, was still weeks away. The story began much earlier, in the depths of winter, when desperation drove decisions that would change everything. The advertisement had been simple enough, scratched out in Christopher's careful handwriting and sent to the territorial newspaper with his last few coins. "Mountain man seeks wife. Must be hardy, willing to work, able to bear isolation. Serious inquiries only." He had not mentioned his appearance, scarred and weathered by decades of harsh living. He had not mentioned his temper, quick to flare and slow to cool. He had not mentioned the loneliness that ate at him like a cancer, driving him to seek companionship even as he sabotaged every attempt at human connection. The first bride arrived on a Tuesday in March, when the snow still lay thick on the ground and the wind carried the promise of more storms to come. She was a delicate thing, all pale skin and trembling hands, and she took one look at Christopher's towering frame and scarred face and began to weep. He had tried in his clumsy way to be gentle. He had offered her coffee, shown her the cabin he had built with his own hands, explained the life they might build together. But her tears had turned to sobs, and by evening, she was begging the mail carrier to take her back to town. The second bride lasted 3 days. She was made of sterner stuff, a farmer's daughter who had known hardship, but Christopher's deliberate coldness wore her down like water on stone. He spoke to her only when necessary, answered her questions with grunts and glares, and made it clear through every action that he regretted his decision to seek a wife. When she finally left, her parting words cut deeper than any blade. "You are not a man," she had said, her voice thick with disgust. "You are a beast, and you deserve to die alone in this God-forsaken place." The third bride was gone before the sun set on her first day. Christopher had met her at the door with a bottle of whiskey in his hand and cruelty in his heart, determined to drive her away before she could burrow under his skin like the others. He succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, watching her flee into the gathering dusk with a satisfaction that tasted like ash in his mouth. By the time Victoria Howard stepped down from the mail wagon on that crisp October morning, Christopher had perfected his technique. He had driven away 7 brides in total, each one leaving with tears or curses or both. The townspeople whispered about him now, calling him mad, dangerous, a man who lured innocent women to his mountain lair only to torment them. The whispers suited him fine. They kept people away, preserved the isolation he told himself he craved. Victoria was different from the first moment he laid eyes on her. Where the others had been small and delicate, she was large and substantial, her body carrying extra weight like a badge of honor rather than shame. Her hair was dark brown, streaked with premature silver, and pulled back in a practical bun that spoke of a woman who valued function over fashion. Her dress was simple but well made, the fabric straining slightly across her generous curves, but tailored with obvious care. She carried herself with a confidence that made Christopher's prepared cruelties die in his throat. She surveyed his cabin with intelligent eyes, taking in the solid construction, the carefully chinked logs, the smoke rising straight and true from the stone chimney. When her gaze finally settled on him, there was no fear there. No revulsion at his scarred face and imposing frame. There was only curiosity, as if she were studying a particularly interesting specimen. "You must be Christopher," she said, her voice warm and steady. "I am Victoria Howard. I believe you are expecting me." He had been expecting her, but not like this. Not this calm acceptance, this complete lack of intimidation. The other brides had cowered or wept or fled at first sight of him. Victoria simply stood there, waiting for him to remember his manners and invite her inside. The cabin felt smaller with her in it, not because of her physical presence, but because of the way she seemed to fill every corner with her quiet confidence. She examined everything with the same careful attention she had given the exterior, running her fingers along the smooth surface of his handmade table, testing the strength of the chairs, peering into the corners where shadows gathered. When she spoke, it was with the voice of someone making practical assessments rather than passing judgment. "This is well built," she said, settling into one of his chairs with a soft sigh of satisfaction. "You have skilled hands, Christopher. The workmanship is excellent." He had been prepared for tears, for demands to be taken back to town immediately, for the kind of horrified rejection he had grown accustomed to receiving. Victoria's calm approval threw him completely off balance, leaving him standing in the middle of his own cabin like a stranger in his own home. The first test came that evening, when he deliberately served her burned stew and bitter coffee, watching her face for the disgust he was certain would appear. Victoria tasted both without comment, then rose from the table and moved to his small kitchen area. She examined his supplies with the same methodical thoroughness she had shown the cabin, then began to work. Within an hour, she had transformed his meager pantry into a meal that filled the cabin with rich, savory smells. She moved around his kitchen with surprising grace for such a large woman, her movements economical and purposeful. When she finally set the improved stew before him, it was accompanied by fresh biscuits that were somehow light and fluffy, despite being made from his coarse flour. "You were testing me," she said as they ate in silence. "I understand the impulse, but it was unnecessary. I am not so easily discouraged." Christopher ate without speaking, but inside his chest something twisted painfully. No one had ever called him on his deliberate cruelties before. No one had ever seen through his test to the desperate loneliness beneath. He finished his meal in silence, then retreated to his chair by the fire, leaving Victoria to clean up the dishes he had fully expected her to abandon in disgust. She washed every plate and cup with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, then joined him by the fire. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with unspoken questions and possibilities. Christopher found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting the strong line of her jaw, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way the firelight caught the silver threads in her hair. "Tell me about this place," she said finally. "How long have you lived here?" The question was simple enough, but Christopher found himself reluctant to answer. Talking about his life meant revealing the choices that had led him to this isolation, the failures and disappointments that had driven him to seek solitude in the wilderness. But Victoria waited with the patience of someone accustomed to drawing information from reluctant sources, and eventually the words began to come. He told her about arriving in the territory 15 years ago, young and full of dreams about making his fortune in gold or timber. He told her about the claim that had proved worthless, the business partnerships that had failed, the gradual realization that he was better suited to solitude than society. He did not tell her about the woman in Denver who had laughed at his proposal, or the friends who had abandoned him when his luck turned sour, or the slow, bitter process of learning to trust no one but himself. Victoria listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When he finally fell silent, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with thoughtful eyes. "Loneliness is a hard burden to bear," she said finally. "I understand why you might choose isolation over the risk of further disappointment." Her words hit him like a physical blow, cutting through his defenses with surgical precision. No one had ever understood before. No one had ever seen past his anger and bitterness to the wounded man beneath. He wanted to lash out, to drive her away before she could hurt him the way everyone else had, but the words would not come. The second day brought the real test, the one that had sent every other bride fleeing in horror or disgust. Christopher woke before dawn, as was his habit, and began his morning routine with deliberate noise and aggression. He slammed pots and pans, cursed at the fire when it would not catch quickly enough, and generally made as much racket as possible in the small cabin. Previous brides had cowered under their blankets or emerged tearful and complaining about his inconsiderate behavior. Victoria appeared in the doorway, between the main room and the small alcove where she had spent the night, fully dressed and alert despite the early hour. She surveyed his performance with the same calm assessment she brought to everything else, then moved to the kitchen area and began preparing breakfast. She worked around his deliberately clumsy movements with fluid grace, somehow managing to complete her tasks without ever seeming to hurry or get in his way. "Good morning, Christopher," she said cheerfully, as if his surly behavior was perfectly normal. "I trust you slept well." He grunted in response, determined to maintain his hostile facade, but Victoria seemed entirely unperturbed by his rudeness. She hummed softly as she worked, a melody he did not recognize but found oddly soothing. By the time she set breakfast on the table, the cabin was filled with the warm smells of bacon and eggs and fresh coffee, and Christopher's planned tantrum had somehow dissipated into sullen confusion. The meal was excellent, far better than anything he had managed to prepare for himself in years of solitary living. Victoria ate with obvious enjoyment, occasionally commenting on the quality of his supplies or asking practical questions about his routines. She seemed genuinely interested in the mechanics of his daily life, from the way he maintained his tools to his methods for preserving meat through the long winter months. After breakfast, Christopher announced his intention to check his trap lines, expecting Victoria to demand that he stay and entertain her, or to complain about being left alone in an unfamiliar place. Instead, she asked if she might accompany him, explaining that she was curious about his methods and eager to learn about the country that would be her new home. The request caught him completely off guard. None of the previous brides had shown any interest in his work or his land. They had seen only the isolation and hardship, the primitive conditions and lack of civilized comforts. Victoria seemed to see possibilities where others had seen only problems. The trail to his furthest trap line was rough and steep, winding through dense forest and across rocky streams that would challenge even an experienced hiker. Christopher set a deliberately punishing pace, expecting Victoria to fall behind or complain about the difficulty. He had used the same tactic on the fourth bride, a woman who had prided herself on her outdoor skills but had been reduced to tears within the first mile. Victoria kept pace with him easily, her breathing steady and unlabored despite her size. She moved through the forest with surprising grace, stepping carefully over fallen logs and navigating the rocky sections with the confidence of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. When they paused at a creek crossing, she was barely winded, while Christopher found himself breathing harder than he cared to admit. "You move well in the woods," he said grudgingly, the first genuine compliment he had paid any of his prospective brides. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," Victoria replied, kneeling by the stream to splash cool water on her face. "My father believed that work was good for the soul, regardless of whether you were male or female. I learned early that physical challenges are often more mental than physical." The comment stung because it was true. Christopher had been testing her endurance not because he needed a partner who could handle the physical demands of mountain life, but because he wanted to find reasons to reject her before she could reject him. Victoria's easy competence made his sabotage attempts seem petty and obvious. They spent the morning checking traps and resetting snares, Victoria asking intelligent questions about animal behavior and trap placement. She listened carefully to his explanations, occasionally offering observations that showed a keen understanding of wildlife patterns. By the time they headed back to the cabin, Christopher found himself actually enjoying her company, a realization that terrified him more than any physical threat ever could. The afternoon brought another test, this one more subtle but potentially more devastating. Christopher had learned that the surest way to drive away a prospective bride was to demonstrate his complete lack of social graces, his inability to make polite conversation, or show proper consideration for a lady's sensibilities. He began the campaign over lunch, eating with deliberate messiness and making crude comments about the food and his living conditions. Victoria listened to his performance with the same patient attention she gave everything else, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement. When he finished his litany of complaints and self-deprecation, she was quiet for a moment, then spoke with gentle firmness. "Christopher," she said, setting down her fork and looking directly into his eyes, "I understand that you are trying to drive me away. I recognize the techniques because I have seen them used before, by people who were afraid of being hurt or abandoned. What I do not understand is why you are working so hard to sabotage something that could be good for both of us." Her directness left him speechless. No one had ever confronted his defensive behavior so calmly or with such clear understanding of their purpose. He felt exposed, as if she had stripped away all his carefully constructed barriers and seen straight through to the frightened, lonely man beneath. "I am not easily discouraged," Victoria continued, her voice remaining gentle but firm. "I did not come here expecting perfection or romance or easy companionship. I came here because I am tired of being alone, and because I believe that two people who are willing to work together can build something worthwhile, even under difficult circumstances." The honesty in her words was devastating. Christopher had spent so many years building walls around his heart that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone speak to him with such straightforward sincerity. He wanted to respond, to match her honesty with his own, but the words stuck in his throat like stones. That evening, as they sat by the fire after another excellent meal Victoria had somehow coaxed from his limited supplies, Christopher made his most serious attempt yet to drive her away. He began drinking, something he rarely did but which had proven effective with the sixth bride, a temperance advocate who had been horrified by his descent into drunken belligerence. Victoria watched him pour glass after glass of whiskey without comment, continuing to work on mending one of his shirts that she had noticed needed attention. Her fingers moved deftly through the fabric, creating neat, even stitches that would make the garment stronger than it had been when new. The domestic scene was so peaceful, so normal, that Christopher found his planned performance losing steam before it truly began. The whiskey burned his throat and clouded his thoughts, but it did not bring the angry numbness he had hoped for. Instead, it seemed to sharpen his awareness of Victoria's presence, the way the firelight played across her face, the soft sounds of her breathing, the occasional hum of contentment she made while working. He found himself watching her with an intensity that made his chest ache. "You are staring," Victoria said without looking up from her sewing. "Is there something you wanted to say?" The question, delivered in her calm, matter-of-fact tone, cut through his whiskey-fueled haze like a blade. Christopher realized he had been staring, had been studying her face with the desperate attention of a man trying to memorize something precious before it was taken away. The realization embarrassed and frightened him in equal measure. "Why are you here?" he asked, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Really here, I mean. Not the polite reasons you give, but the real ones." Victoria set down her sewing and looked at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment, Christopher thought she would deflect the question or offer some socially acceptable platitude. Instead, she was quiet for a long time, considering her words with the same care she brought to everything else. "Because I am tired of being invisible," she said finally. "Because I am tired of being the woman people look through instead of at, the one they assume has no desires or dreams or needs of her own. Because I want to matter to someone, to be seen as valuable for who I am, rather than dismissed for what I look like." The raw honesty in her voice hit Christopher like a physical blow. He recognized the pain behind her words because it mirrored his own, the deep ache of being judged and found wanting, of being reduced to surface appearances rather than seen as a complete human being. In that moment, he understood that Victoria had not come to his mountain out of desperation or lack of options, but out of the same lonely courage that had driven him to place his advertisement in the first place. "I am not a good man," he said, the whiskey making the admission easier than it should have been. "I am angry and bitter, and I hurt people before they can hurt me. Every woman who has come here has left, and they were right to leave. You should leave too, before I damage you the way I have damaged everything else in my life." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze steady on his face. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of conviction that made his chest tighten. "I do not believe that," she said simply. "I think you are a man who has been hurt badly and who has learned to hurt others as a way of protecting himself. I think you are lonely and afraid and convinced that you are unworthy of love or companionship. But I do not think you are irredeemable, Christopher. I think you are worth saving, even if you do not believe it yourself." Her words hung in the air between them like a benediction, and Christopher felt something crack inside his chest. No one had ever spoken to him with such gentle certainty, such unwavering faith in his potential for goodness. He wanted to believe her, wanted to let her words heal the wounds that had festered in his heart for so many years. But the fear was too strong, too deeply rooted. He drank until the whiskey bottle was empty, until his vision blurred and his words slurred together. But Victoria remained by the fire, patient and unafraid. When he finally passed out in his chair, she covered him with a blanket and banked the fire for the night, then retreated to her alcove without a word of reproach. Christopher woke the next morning with a pounding headache and a mouth that tasted like ashes, expecting to find Victoria gone, fled in the night like so many others. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the same calm efficiency she had shown every morning since her arrival. She greeted him with a cheerful good morning and a cup of strong coffee, as if his drunken confession and subsequent collapse were perfectly normal occurrences. The kindness in her eyes was almost unbearable. Christopher had expected judgment, disgust, the kind of moral superiority that would justify his worst opinions about human nature. Instead, Victoria looked at him with the same gentle understanding she had shown from the beginning, as if his failures and weaknesses were simply facts to be acknowledged rather than sins to be condemned. Over the following days, Christopher escalated his campaign of deliberate unpleasantness, determined to find the breaking point that would send Victoria fleeing back to civilization. He was rude to her in the mornings, sullen during their shared meals, and openly hostile whenever she tried to engage him in conversation. He left his clothes and personal items scattered around the cabin, expecting her to complain about his messiness. He came home from his daily work covered in dirt and sweat, tracking mud across the floors she had scrubbed clean. Victoria absorbed it all with the patience of a saint, neither complaining about his behavior nor attempting to reform him through lectures or tears. She simply continued with her daily routines, cooking excellent meals, maintaining the cabin, mending his clothes, and treating him with the same courteous consideration she had shown from the first day. Her refusal to be provoked into anger or tears was more unsettling than any emotional outburst would have been. The breaking point came on a gray November morning when Christopher woke to find Victoria kneeling by the fireplace, carefully feeding kindling to the dying coals. She was still in her nightgown, a modest white cotton garment that somehow managed to be both practical and feminine, and her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders in waves that caught the growing firelight. The domestic scene was so peaceful, so right, that Christopher felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble like walls made of sand. The realization that he was falling in love with her hit him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and making his hands shake with something that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Love was a luxury he could not afford, a weakness that would only lead to more pain and disappointment. He had to drive her away now, before she burrowed any deeper under his skin, before her inevitable departure could destroy him completely. He rose from his bed with deliberate noise, stomping across the floor and slamming cabinet doors as he prepared his morning coffee. Victoria glanced up at him with a small smile, seemingly unaware of the storm building behind his eyes. "Good morning, Christopher," she said softly. The fire was nearly out. "I hope you do not mind that I took the liberty of rebuilding it." Her consideration, her gentle assumption of domestic responsibilities, only made his panic worse. She was making herself indispensable, weaving herself into the fabric of his daily life in ways that would make her absence unbearable. He had to stop it now, had to drive her away with such cruelty that she would never consider returning. "I did not ask for your help," he snarled, his voice deliberately harsh. "I have been managing this cabin perfectly well, without interference from meddling women who think they know better than I do about my own home." Victoria's smile faltered slightly, but she did not retreat or show the hurt he was trying to inflict. Instead, she rose gracefully from her knees and smoothed down her nightgown with hands that remained perfectly steady. "Of course," she said mildly. I simply thought it would be more efficient to rebuild the fire while I was already awake. I meant no offense. Her calm response only fueled his desperation. Christopher needed her to fight back, to show anger or hurt that would justify his cruelty and make her departure easier to bear. Her continued kindness in the face of his deliberate nastiness was like salt in an open wound, making him lash out with increasing viciousness. Efficient, he repeated mockingly. Is that what you call it when you rearrange a man's home to suit your own preferences? When you take over his kitchen and his routines without so much as asking permission? I suppose next you will be telling me how to run my trap lines and manage my business affairs. This time he saw the hurt flash across her face, quickly hidden but unmistakably there. The sight should have satisfied him, should have felt like victory in his campaign to drive her away. Instead, it made him feel sick with self-loathing, as if he had kicked a faithful dog that had done nothing but try to please him. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but it carried an undertone of steel that he had never heard from her. I see, she said simply. I understand now what this is about. Her words sent a chill down Christopher's spine, but he forced himself to maintain his hostile facade. He could not afford to show weakness now, not when he was so close to achieving his goal of driving her away. You understand nothing, he said coldly. You are a stranger here, an intruder who has imposed herself on my hospitality and now seeks to remake my life according to her own desires. I never asked for a wife who would hover and fuss and try to manage every aspect of my existence. The words were lies, every single one of them, but Christopher delivered them with the conviction of a man fighting for his life. Victoria listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each cruel syllable. When he finally fell silent, she was quiet for so long that he began to think his campaign had finally succeeded. Then she smiled, a small, sad expression that somehow managed to convey both understanding and forgiveness, and Christopher felt his world tilt on its axis. Oh, Christopher, she said softly, you poor, frightened man. You are so afraid of being hurt that you would rather destroy something beautiful before it has a chance to grow. You would rather drive away someone who cares for you than risk the possibility that they might leave on their own. Her words hit him like arrows, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. Christopher felt his carefully constructed anger crumble, leaving him naked and vulnerable in a way that terrified him more than any physical threat ever could. I am not afraid, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Victoria stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden motion. When she reached out to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his scarred cheek, Christopher felt his breath catch in his throat. Yes, you are, she said softly. You are terrified, and that is understandable, given what you have endured. But fear is not a reason to destroy something that could bring joy to both our lives. Christopher wanted to pull away, to maintain the distance that had kept him safe for so many years, but he found himself frozen by the warmth in her touch and the compassion in her eyes. No one had touched him with such tenderness in longer than he could remember. No one had looked at him as if he were worthy of love and care, rather than fear and disgust. The moment stretched between them like a bridge spanning a vast chasm, fragile and precious and terrifying in its implications. Christopher felt himself balanced on the edge of something that would change his life forever, and the vertigo was almost overwhelming. He could step forward into the unknown territory of trust and vulnerability, or he could step back into the familiar darkness of isolation and self-protection. Before he could make the choice, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the intimate silence. Christopher jerked away from Victoria's touch as if he had been burned, his defensive instincts reasserting themselves with painful intensity. Through the cabin window, he could see 3 riders approaching, their faces grim beneath the brims of their hats. Christopher recognized them immediately. Scott Ortiz, the territorial sheriff, flanked by 2 of his deputies. Their presence on his mountain could only mean trouble, and Christopher felt his stomach clench with familiar dread. He had been expecting this visit for weeks, ever since the rumors about his treatment of the mail-order brides had begun circulating in town. Victoria moved to stand beside him at the window, her presence both comforting and complicating. She studied the approaching riders with the same calm assessment she brought to everything else, showing no sign of fear or concern despite the obvious tension in the air. "Friends of yours?" she asked quietly. "Not exactly," Christopher replied, his voice tight with apprehension. "The sheriff and his men. They are probably here because of the stories people have been telling about me." Victoria nodded thoughtfully, then moved away from the window and began straightening her appearance with quick, efficient movements. She pinned her hair back into its usual neat bun and smoothed the wrinkles from her dress, transforming herself from the intimate woman who had touched his face with such tenderness into the composed lady who had first stepped down from the mail wagon. "Then we should greet them properly," she said calmly. "It would be impolite to keep them waiting." Her composure in the face of potential danger was both admirable and infuriating. Christopher wanted to protect her from what was coming, to shield her from the ugliness that his past actions had brought to his doorstep. But Victoria seemed determined to face whatever challenges arose with the same steady courage she had shown since her arrival. The knock on the door came sharp and authoritative, the sound echoing through the cabin like a death knell. Christopher opened it to find Sheriff Ortiz standing on his threshold, his weathered face set in lines of official disapproval. Behind him, the two deputies flanked the doorway, with their hands resting casually on their gun belts, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "Gray," the sheriff said without preamble. "We need to talk." Christopher stepped aside to let the men enter, acutely aware of Victoria standing behind him like a silent sentinel. The cabin felt smaller with 5 adults crowded into it, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Sheriff Ortiz surveyed the interior with sharp eyes, taking in the neat, comfortable domesticity that Victoria had brought to the rough space. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat in Victoria's direction, "I am Sheriff Ortiz. I do not believe we have been introduced." Victoria stepped forward with the grace of a woman accustomed to social situations, extending her hand with perfect composure. "Victoria Howard," she said warmly, "I am Christopher's wife." The words hit Christopher like a physical blow, not because they were untrue, but because of the way Victoria said them, with such natural conviction that even he almost believed they were legally married. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, but he accepted her handshake with the courtesy due a respectable woman. "Mrs. Gray," the sheriff said, his tone carefully neutral, "I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but we have received some disturbing reports about your husband's treatment of previous visitors to this property. I felt it was my duty to investigate these claims personally." Victoria's expression remained perfectly composed, but Christopher could see the quick intelligence working behind her dark eyes. She understood immediately what was at stake, the delicate balance between truth and perception that would determine the outcome of this confrontation. "I am not sure what reports you may have heard, Sheriff," she said with gentle firmness, "but I can assure you that my husband has treated me with nothing but respect and consideration since my arrival. Perhaps there has been some misunderstanding." The sheriff studied her face carefully, clearly looking for signs of coercion or fear. Christopher held his breath, waiting for Victoria to reveal the truth about his deliberate cruelties, his systematic campaign to drive away every woman who had sought to build a life with him. Instead, she met the sheriff's gaze with steady confidence, her posture and demeanor that of a woman who was exactly where she chose to be. "Ma'am," the sheriff said slowly, "I have spoken with several young ladies who claim that your husband treated them with deliberate cruelty, that he made their lives so miserable they were forced to flee for their own safety and well-being. These are serious accusations that cannot be ignored." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had given the matter careful consideration. "Sheriff Ortiz," she said calmly, "I cannot speak to the experiences of others, but I can tell you that every person who enters into marriage brings their own expectations and assumptions about what that relationship should look like. Sometimes those expectations are unrealistic, and when reality fails to match the fantasy, disappointment and resentment can follow." Her words were carefully chosen, neither defending Christopher's actions nor condemning the women who had fled his mountain. Instead, she presented an alternative interpretation of events that cast doubt on the simple narrative of victimization that had brought the sheriff to their door. The sheriff frowned, clearly unsatisfied with Victoria's diplomatic response. He turned his attention to Christopher, his pale eyes hard with suspicion and barely contained hostility. "Gray," he said sharply, "I want to hear from you directly. Did you or did you not deliberately mistreat the women who came here seeking marriage? Did you drive them away through cruelty and intimidation?" Christopher felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. The truth would condemn him, would likely result in his arrest and the destruction of the life he had built on this mountain. But lying would make Victoria complicit in his deception, would force her to maintain a facade that protected a man who had spent weeks trying to drive her away. He looked at Victoria, expecting to see fear or uncertainty in her eyes, some sign that she regretted her decision to stand by him in the face of official scrutiny. Instead, he saw the same steady confidence she had shown from the beginning, as if she trusted him to find the right words even when he did not trust himself. "Sheriff," Christopher said slowly, choosing his words with the same care Victoria had shown, "I will not pretend that I am an easy man to live with. I am rough around the edges, set in my ways, and not given to the kind of courtesies that some women expect from a husband. If my manner seemed harsh to previous visitors, it was not out of deliberate cruelty, but out of a desire to ensure that any woman who chose to stay would do so with full knowledge of what that choice entailed. It was not quite a lie, but it was not the whole truth either. Christopher had indeed been testing the women who came to his mountain, but his methods had been designed to drive them away rather than ensure their informed consent. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and he could only hope that the sheriff would not probe too deeply into the specifics. Sheriff Ortiz studied both of them for a long moment, his experienced eyes moving back and forth between Christopher's carefully controlled expression and Victoria's serene confidence. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind in the pines. "Mrs. Gray," the sheriff said finally, "I need you to understand that if you are being coerced or threatened in any way, I can provide protection and assistance. You do not have to remain here if you do not wish to do so." Victoria smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I can assure you that I am here entirely by my own choice. My husband may be rough around the edges, as he says, but he is also hardworking, honest, and capable of great kindness when the mood strikes him." The last part was a gentle fabrication, but Victoria delivered it with such conviction that Christopher almost believed it himself. He had shown her precious little kindness since her arrival, had in fact gone out of his way to make her life difficult and unpleasant. Yet here she was, defending him to the law with a loyalty he had done nothing to earn. The sheriff was clearly frustrated by their united front, but without evidence of actual wrongdoing or a complaint from Victoria herself, his hands were tied. He spent another few minutes asking probing questions about their daily routines, their relationship, and Victoria's plans for the future, but her answers remained consistent and unshakable. "Very well," Sheriff Ortiz said finally, his tone suggesting that he remained unconvinced but was powerless to act on his suspicions. "Mrs. Gray, I want you to know that my office is always available if you need assistance of any kind. Gray, I will be keeping an eye on this situation. Any further complaints about your treatment of women will be investigated thoroughly." Christopher nodded stiffly, not trusting himself to speak. The sheriff's implied threat was clear enough, and they both knew that Christopher was walking a very thin line between freedom and serious legal consequences. As the three men prepared to leave, Sheriff Ortiz turned back for one final warning. "Gray," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you have a good woman here. I suggest you treat her accordingly, because if I hear even a whisper of mistreatment, I will be back. And next time, I will not be so understanding." The threat hung in the air like smoke as the sheriff and his deputies mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Christopher and Victoria alone in the sudden silence of their cabin. Christopher stood at the window watching until the riders disappeared among the trees, his hands shaking with reaction to the confrontation he had barely survived. When he finally turned away from the window, he found Victoria watching him with an expression he could not quite read. There was no triumph in her eyes, No sense of victory over his narrow escape from justice. Instead, there was something that looked almost like sadness, as if she regretted the necessity of the deception they had just perpetrated together. Why? Christopher asked, his voice rough with emotion he could not quite identify. Why did you lie for me? You could have told him the truth, could have had him take you away from here. You could have been free. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. When she spoke, her voice was soft but filled with a conviction that made his chest tighten. Because I choose to be here, Christopher. Because despite your best efforts to drive me away, I have seen glimpses of the man you could be. The man you are when you stop trying so hard to protect yourself from being hurt. Because I believe that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even those who do not believe they deserve it themselves. Her words hit him like a physical blow, stripping away the last of his defensive anger and leaving him raw and vulnerable in a way that terrified him. No one had ever fought for him before, had ever chosen to see his potential for goodness rather than focusing on his obvious flaws and failures. The days following the sheriff's visit passed in a strange, suspended tension that neither Christopher nor Victoria seemed willing to break. The threat of official scrutiny had forced them into an alliance of necessity, but the deeper questions raised by Victoria's fierce defense of him remained unspoken and unresolved. Christopher found himself watching her with new eyes, seeing not just the woman he had been trying to drive away, but the partner who had stood beside him when everything hung in the balance. Victoria continued her daily routines with the same calm efficiency she had shown from the beginning, but Christopher noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She no longer hummed while she worked, and the easy contentment that had characterized her first weeks on the mountain seemed to have given way to something more guarded and thoughtful. She was still kind to him, still treated him with courtesy and consideration, but there was a distance now that had not been there before. The realization that he missed her warmth hit Christopher like a physical blow. For weeks, he had been working systematically to destroy any possibility of genuine connection between them. And now that he had succeeded, the emptiness felt unbearable. He had gotten exactly what he thought he wanted, and it was ashes in his mouth. Winter was coming early to the high country, and the practical demands of preparation provided a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm them both. Christopher threw himself into the work of securing the cabin against the harsh weather to come, repairing loose chinking between the logs, checking the integrity of the roof, and laying in supplies that would see them through the months of isolation ahead. Victoria proved herself invaluable during these preparations, working alongside him with a competence that both surprised and impressed him. She helped him split and stack firewood, her movements economical and efficient despite her size. She preserved meat and vegetables with the skill of someone who had learned such tasks from childhood, creating stores that would keep them fed when fresh food became impossible to obtain. Working together in the crisp autumn air, focused on the practical necessities of survival, they found a rhythm that felt almost natural. Christopher caught himself relaxing in her presence, forgetting for moments at a time the complicated emotions that lay between them. Victoria seemed to feel it too, her guarded distance softening into something that resembled their earlier companionship. It was during one of these moments, as they worked together to repair a section of the cabin's foundation that had been damaged by frost, that Victoria finally broke the silence that had stretched between them since the sheriff's visit. "Christopher," she said quietly, not looking up from the stones she was fitting into place, "we need to talk about what happened the other day." Christopher's hands stilled on the timber he was positioning, his stomach clenching with familiar dread. He had been expecting this conversation, had been dreading it since the moment the sheriff and his men had ridden away. Victoria had every right to demand explanations, to confront him about the lies she had told on his behalf and the truths that lay beneath them. "I know," he said simply, his voice rough with the effort of keeping his emotions under control. "I know we do." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her hands continuing their methodical work even as her attention focused inward. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of sadness that made Christopher's chest ache. "I lied to the sheriff," she said softly. "I told him that you had treated me with respect and consideration, But we both know that is not entirely true. You have been trying to drive me away since the day I arrived, using every cruel method you could devise to make my life here unbearable. The words were delivered without anger or accusation, but they cut deeper than any furious denunciation could have. Christopher felt his face burn with shame, not just for his actions, but for the fact that Victoria had been forced to compromise her own integrity to protect him from the consequences of those actions. Yes, he said quietly. Yes, I have. The admission hung in the air between them, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of consequence in all directions. Christopher waited for Victoria to continue, to demand explanations or justifications or promises of change. Instead, she was quiet for so long that he began to wonder if she had said all she intended to say. Why? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Why did you work so hard to hurt someone who came here wanting nothing more than to build a life with you? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. Christopher struggled to find words that could explain the fear and self-loathing that had driven his actions. The deep conviction that he was unworthy of love or companionship that had made driving Victoria away seemed like an act of mercy rather than cruelty. Because I was afraid, he said finally, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Because everyone who has ever mattered to me has left, and I thought it would hurt less if I drove you away myself rather than waiting for you to realize what a mistake you had made and leave on your own. Victoria's hands stilled on the stones she was placing, and when she looked up at him, her dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. The sight of her pain, pain that he had caused through his own cowardice and selfishness, was almost unbearable. Oh, Christopher, she said softly, do you not understand? I am not like the others. I did not come here with romantic fantasies about mountain life or unrealistic expectations about what marriage should be. I came here because I was tired of being alone, because I wanted to matter to someone, to build something meaningful with another person who understood what it meant to be lonely. Her words hit him like arrows, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. Christopher felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble completely, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way that should have terrified him, but somehow felt like relief. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Christopher had ever experienced. Sitting on the ground beside the partially repaired foundation, surrounded by the tools and materials of their shared labor, he and Victoria began to speak honestly about their fears, their failures, and their desperate hunger for connection. Victoria told him about her childhood as the largest girl in her small Missouri town, about the casual cruelties of children who had made her size the defining characteristic of her existence. She spoke of the men who had looked through her as if she were invisible, the social gatherings where she had stood alone against the wall, the gradual realization that she would have to create her own opportunities for happiness rather than waiting for them to be offered. Christopher found himself sharing things he had never spoken aloud to another human being. He told her about his father's drinking and the violence that had driven him from home at 15. He spoke of the woman in Denver who had laughed at his proposal, not out of cruelty, but out of genuine disbelief that a man like him could imagine himself worthy of someone like her. He described the slow, corrosive process of learning to expect rejection, to armor himself against disappointment by ensuring that it came on his own terms rather than someone else's. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows lengthened around them, Christopher felt something shifting inside his chest, as if walls that had stood for decades were finally beginning to crack and crumble. Victoria listened to his confessions without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped him dig deeper into truths he had spent years avoiding. When the sun began to set and the mountain air turned cold enough to drive them inside, they had not solved anything, had not made grand declarations or promises about the future. But something fundamental had changed between them. Some barrier had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. They prepared dinner together in companionable silence, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an ease that felt both new and ancient. That night, as they sat by the fire after their meal, Victoria took up her mending again, but instead of working on Christopher's clothes, she was sewing something new, something that looked like it might be a shirt size for a man of his proportions. The sight of her working to create something for him after weeks of his deliberate cruelty, made his throat tight with emotion he could not name. "Victoria," he said quietly, his voice rough with the effort of speaking past the tightness in his chest. "I do not deserve your kindness. I do not deserve your loyalty or your forgiveness or the way you defended me to the sheriff. I have done nothing but try to hurt you since you arrived. And you have responded with more grace and compassion than I have shown to any human being in my entire adult life." Victoria looked up from her sewing, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment she was quiet, considering his words with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but filled with a conviction that made his chest ache. "Christopher," she said gently, "worthiness is not something we earn through perfect behavior or flawless character. It is something we possess simply by virtue of being human, of being alive and capable of growth and change. You have been cruel to me, yes, but you have also shown me glimpses of kindness and vulnerability that tell me who you really are beneath all that protective anger." Her words were like water on parched ground, soaking into places in his soul that had been dry for so long he had forgotten they existed. Christopher wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the forgiveness and understanding she offered so freely, but the habits of self-protection were strong and deeply ingrained. "How can you be sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can you know that I will not hurt you again, that I will not revert to the same cruel patterns that have defined my relationships with everyone who has tried to get close to me?" Victoria set down her sewing and leaned forward slightly, her gaze holding his with gentle intensity. "Because I have seen you when you think no one is watching," she said softly. "I have seen the way you care for injured animals, the pride you take in work well done, the loneliness in your eyes when you think about the life you might have had if you had been braver. I have seen your capacity for tenderness, Christopher, even when you were working so hard to hide it from me." The truth in her words was undeniable, but it was also terrifying. If Victoria could see past his defenses to the man he might be, then he could no longer hide behind the comfortable fiction that he was irredeemably damaged, unworthy of love or companionship. Her faith in him created possibilities that were both wonderful and frightening, opening doors he had kept locked for so long that he had forgotten they existed. The silence that followed was different from the tense, charged quiet that had characterized their earlier interactions. This silence was peaceful, contemplative, filled with the weight of things acknowledged and barriers crossed. Christopher found himself studying Victoria's face in the firelight, noting the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the way her mouth curved slightly upward, even in repose, as if she carried some secret source of contentment within her. For the first time since her arrival, he allowed himself to really see her, not as an obstacle to be overcome or a threat to be neutralized, but as a woman of substance and character who had chosen to stand beside him when she could have easily walked away. The realization was both humbling and transformative, shifting something fundamental in how he understood himself and his place in the world. The next morning brought the first snow of the season, fat flakes that fell steadily from a pewter sky and transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and strange. Christopher woke to find Victoria already up, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the snow fall with an expression of quiet wonder on her face. "It is beautiful," she said softly when she noticed he was awake. "I have never seen snow fall this heavily, this early in the season. It makes everything look clean and new." Christopher joined her at the window, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him with a nod of thanks. The snow was indeed beautiful, but it was also ominous. This much snow this early in the season suggested a long, harsh winter ahead, the kind that could trap them on the mountain for months with no possibility of outside contact or assistance. "We will need to check the animals," he said, his mind already turning to the practical concerns that snow brought with it. "Make sure they have adequate shelter and feed. This storm looks like it might last for days." Victoria nodded, setting down her coffee cup and moving toward the hooks where their heavy coats hung. "I will help," she said simply, as if there had never been any question that they would face the challenges of winter together. They spent the morning battening down against the storm, checking on Christopher's small herd of goats and the chickens that provided their eggs, ensuring that all the animals had adequate food and water and protection from the wind. Victoria worked alongside him with the same competent efficiency she brought to everything else, her movements sure and purposeful despite the unfamiliar demands of caring for livestock in a snowstorm. By afternoon, the snow had accumulated to nearly a foot in depth, and the wind had picked up enough to create drifts against the cabin walls. Christopher and Victoria found themselves effectively trapped inside, with no choice but to wait out the storm in each other's company. Under different circumstances, the forced intimacy might have been unbearable for Christopher, but something had shifted between them during their honest conversation the day before. Some barrier had been crossed that made their confinement feel less like a trap and more like an opportunity. They spent the afternoon in companionable domesticity, Victoria working on her sewing while Christopher repaired some of his tools that had been damaged during the summer's work. The silence between them was comfortable rather than tense, filled with the peaceful sounds of shared labor and the storm raging outside their walls. As evening approached and Victoria began preparing dinner, Christopher found himself watching her with new eyes. He noticed the graceful way she moved despite her size, the careful attention she paid to even the smallest details of meal preparation, the soft humming that had returned to her work now that the worst of the tension between them had been resolved. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to share his life with her permanently, to build something lasting and meaningful together. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Victoria had already proven herself capable of handling the harsh realities of mountain life, had shown courage and resilience in the face of his deliberate cruelties, and had demonstrated a loyalty that went far beyond what he had any right to expect. More than that, she had seen past his defensive anger to the lonely, frightened man beneath, and she had chosen to stay anyway. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, listening to the wind howl around the cabin, Victoria surprised him by setting aside her sewing and turning to face him directly. "Christopher," she said, her voice carrying a weight of decision that made him straighten in his chair. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Christopher felt his stomach clench with familiar anxiety, but he nodded, steeling himself for whatever question she might pose. Victoria studied his face for a moment, as if gauging his readiness to hear what she had to say. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked quietly. "Not because you think you should want me to stay, not because it would be practical or convenient, but because you genuinely want to build a life with me, because despite everything that has happened between us, you believe we could be happy together." The question hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning a vast chasm, and Christopher felt himself balanced on the edge of a decision that would determine the course of the rest of his life. He could give her the safe answer, could deflect or equivocate or retreat behind the defensive walls that had protected him for so long. Or he could step forward into the unknown territory of honesty and vulnerability, trusting that Victoria would not use his truth as a weapon against him. Looking into her dark eyes, seeing the hope and fear and determination there, Christopher made his choice. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion, but steady with conviction. "Yes, I want you to stay, not just because you are capable and strong and have proven yourself able to handle the hardships of this life, but because you make me want to be a better man than I have been. Because when I look at you, I see possibilities I thought were lost to me forever. Because I am tired of being alone, and I cannot imagine facing another winter, another year, another day without you beside me." The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had burst inside his chest and released years of pent-up longing and need. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow, and when she smiled, it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Then I will stay," she said simply. "Not as your mail-order bride, not as a woman who came here out of desperation or lack of options, but as your partner, your equal, your wife in every sense that matters. We will build something good together, Christopher, something worth the pain it took to get here." The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them in the cabin with nothing but each other for company and entertainment. Under different circumstances, the enforced intimacy might have been awkward or uncomfortable, But Christopher and Victoria found themselves settling into a rhythm that felt both natural and profound. They worked together, ate together, sat by the fire together in the evenings, and gradually began to learn each other in ways that went far deeper than physical attraction or surface compatibility. Christopher discovered that Victoria was well-read and intelligent, capable of discussing everything from literature to politics, with a depth of knowledge that surprised and impressed him. She had opinions about the territorial government, theories about the best methods for preserving food through the winter, and a dry sense of humor that emerged once she felt safe enough to let her guard down. In turn, Victoria learned about Christopher's unexpected gentleness with injured animals, his skill at crafts that required patience and precision, and the deep well of loneliness that had driven so many of his defensive behaviors. On the third night of the storm, as they prepared for bed in their respective spaces, Victoria paused in the doorway of her alcove and looked back at Christopher with an expression he had never seen from her before. There was something in her eyes that made his breath catch, a warmth and invitation that spoke of possibilities neither of them had dared to acknowledge openly. "Christopher," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of decision and desire that made his heart race. "I do not want to sleep alone tonight. I do not want to pretend that we are merely business partners or convenient companions. We are husband and wife in every way that matters, and I would like to begin acting like it." The invitation was clear, but it was also gentle, offered without pressure or expectation of immediate acceptance. Christopher felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized that Victoria was giving him the choice, trusting him to respond with the same honesty and vulnerability she was showing. He rose from his chair by the fire and crossed to where she stood, his movements slow and deliberate. When he reached her, he lifted his hands to frame her face, his scarred fingers gentle against her soft skin. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, acknowledging the magnitude of the step they were about to take. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "Once we cross this line, there will be no going back. We will be bound to each other in ways that go far beyond legal contracts or social conventions." Victoria's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy and certainty. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," she said softly. "I choose you, Christopher Gray. I choose this life, this mountain, this future we will build together. I choose all of it, and I choose it gladly." Christopher felt something break open inside his chest, releasing years of pent-up longing and need and hope. He leaned down to kiss her, their first kiss, and it was everything he had never dared to dream it could be. Soft and sweet and full of promise. A benediction and a beginning all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Victoria took his hand and led him toward the bed they would share from that night forward. What followed was tender and passionate and healing, a joining that went far beyond the physical to encompass every aspect of their beings. They came together as two people who had been alone too long, who had found in each other something precious and worth fighting for. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the warmth of their shared bed, listening to the storm finally beginning to abate outside their walls, Christopher felt a peace settle over him that he had never experienced before. Victoria's head rested on his shoulder, her breathing deep and even with approaching sleep, and he marveled at the simple miracle of her presence in his life. "You saved me," he whispered into the darkness, his voice so quiet he was not sure she could hear him. Victoria stirred slightly, pressing closer to his warmth. "No," she murmured against his chest, her voice thick with contentment. "We saved each other." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Christopher woke to find Victoria already up, standing at the window in her nightgown, watching the sun rise over a landscape transformed by snow. Everything was white and pristine and beautiful, as if the world had been washed clean and given a fresh start. She turned when she heard him stirring, her face glowing with happiness and the particular radiance of a woman who had been thoroughly loved. "Good morning, husband," she said, the word carrying a weight of joy and satisfaction that made Christopher's chest tighten with emotion. "Good morning, wife," he replied, marveling at how right the words felt in his mouth. How natural it seemed to claim her, to be claimed by her in return. They spent the morning digging out from the storm, clearing paths to the animal shelters and checking on their small herd. The work was hard but satisfying, made lighter by the knowledge that they were working together toward a shared future. Victoria proved herself once again to be a capable partner, handling the physical demands of mountain life with the same competence she brought to everything else. As they worked, Christopher found himself stealing glances at her, still hardly able to believe that this remarkable woman had chosen to stay with him, to build a life with him despite everything he had done to drive her away. The realization that he was truly no longer alone, that he had a partner who understood and accepted him completely, was almost overwhelming in its implications. That afternoon, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal, Victoria brought up a subject that Christopher had been avoiding thinking about. "We should probably make our marriage legal," she said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "When the snow clears enough for travel, we should go into town and speak with the minister. I would like there to be no question about our status in the eyes of the law and the community." Christopher nodded, understanding the practical wisdom of her suggestion, even as his stomach clenched with anxiety about returning to town. The sheriff's warning still echoed in his mind, and he knew that their appearance together would be closely scrutinized by people who had heard the stories about his treatment of previous brides. Victoria seemed to sense his apprehension, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. "We will face whatever comes together," she said softly. "I am not ashamed of my choice to marry you, Christopher, and I will not allow anyone to make me feel that I should be." Her words gave him strength, reminding him that he was no longer facing the world alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as partners, as equals, as two people who had found something precious and worth defending. The wind howled through the pines as Christopher Gray stood in his cabin doorway, his weathered hands gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Before him, Victoria Howard sat at his rough-hewn table, her considerable frame filling the chair with a dignity that made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. Her dark eyes held his gaze without flinching, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of mountains. "I am not leaving, Christopher. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. You can rage and storm and throw whatever tantrum suits your fancy, but I will not be driven away like those others. This is my home now, whether you like it or not, but that moment was still in the future, a declaration of war disguised as devotion that would come only after months of testing and trial. For now, in the quiet aftermath of the storm that had brought them together, Christopher and Victoria began the slow, careful work of building a life together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of trust and vulnerability at a time. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer empty, filled with the promise of shared joys and sorrows, shared work and rest, shared love that had been tested by fire and found strong enough to endure whatever challenges might come. They had found each other against all odds, two lonely souls who had discovered that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can become the strongest foundations for lasting happiness. As the sun set over their snow-covered mountain, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Christopher and Victoria sat together by their fire, planning their future with the quiet confidence of people who had learned that love is not something that happens to you, but something you choose, again and again, every day for the rest of your life.